Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action. Well, welcome to this episode of the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Hyatt, and today I am honored to be joined by classmate and friend, Mark Derbecker. Mark, it's great to have you on the podcast.
I'm glad to be here, Jeff.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I always start with the most difficult question first, and that is, please introduce yourself.
All right. Well, I'm Mark Derbecker, and I'm the Chief Product Officer of Seeq, and that's spelled Seeq. And it's a 12-year-old startup at this point that focuses on time series data analytics.
So, Mark, I'll ask the obvious question I had, and that is for the uninitiated, time series data. Tell me more.
Yeah, I didn't know much about time series data when the company started. I was lucky enough to have a few co-founders that really understood the data type and the market opportunity. But what I'm referring to is data that comes from sensors that are in a manufacturing setting. So think of temperatures and pressures and flow rates on equipment. That data is being broadcast across a control network. It ends up in a database that already exists. There's lots of database vendors out there that store this type of data. It's not SQL data. It's kind of a special type of data because it's you store years and years of it, and it's timestamp value data. And it tends to be samples of real-world analog phenomena like temperatures. So sampled data, which itself has special properties that if you have the right math applied to it and the right sort of tooling, you can make a lot of insights from that data. But if you don't, it can actually be really hard. And so I didn't understand that when we were starting the company. So initially when I started talking to my co-founders, I was like, well, data's data. It's in SQL. It's not, why is this special? And then I really started to understand that the type of math you do and the physics kind of based and calculus based approach that you take to the data is quite different than what you do with normal, let's call it, SQL transactional data.
Got it. And so from that point, that was obviously today we know the value of having data in that form that is able to be analyzed with LLMs, et cetera. But kind of going back in time, when you first thought to start this organization, or you and your co-founders thought to start this company, like, what was the value of data? Why were people saving it? Why were they saving it? And what were they doing with it?
Yeah, they were saving it. And we're talking decades of data.
Wow.
So some of our customers were actually really early on the train of gathering data because they knew that it was critical to their operations. So, our customers are in a variety of industrial sectors, pharmaceutical manufacturing, oil and gas, energy, food and beverage, mining and metals. They all have this type of data. And when they want to optimize their process or they want to root cause a problem, if they have equipment failures, they look at this data. And often the manufacturers, aren't really helping them. They buy machinery, and then it's critical enough that they have a lot of subject matter experts in-house on that equipment and the process itself and the context of the process. And so they've been gathering this data because it's critical to maintaining high operations, especially in commodities businesses. Oil and gas is one of those. Food and beverage is often very commodity, low margins, and so they have to operate extremely efficiently in order to realize the type of profits that they need to. And so this data ends up being super valuable to that end, and that's why they've been collecting it for so long.
So was this back, and again, just to ground folks. So was this back in the era of big data, or how were folks taking this data? How were they analyzing it at the time?
So it goes, the gathering of the data goes back to the like late 80s. You're
Oh, wow.
talking about like, VAX systems and things like that. And so they were gathering it, back then. And the key player was OSI Soft. They supplied a lot of the data gathering and the sort of early analytics capabilities. They were purchased by a company called Aviva. And so they developed some tools to get the data into Excel. And so Excel was the primary tool that a process engineer, so this is typically a person with a chemical engineering background or a petroleum engineering background, they would use this data in Excel, make new columns, make formulas and things like that, and use the rudimentary sort of tools that you have in Excel for looking at that data. So then when you and I are in school, a lot of the buzz was around big data
Right.
and these distributed systems. But what I learned is that actually the big data wave wasn't super applicable to this type of data. And actually the vendors that were already gathering this data had no problem with the scale of the data. So the big data technologies, like you and I were in school, it was Hadoop. Later it became Spark and
Mhm.
Databricks products, Snowflake. And they do play a role, but they weren't necessarily solving a scalability problem. So when the idea for this company came around, it was less about, things have changed with respect to technologies that allow us to scale in data collection and data querying. It was more that actually there's been this unmet need for 20 years around analytics. And the key insight was time series data is very different. You have to build some very specific tools and apply specific math. And that's going to be the differentiator. That's what will make us successful if we go off and do. And nobody has been doing it for 10, 20 years because in many ways, Silicon Valley and the sort of traditional origins of innovation, they tend to focus on other industries. They tend to focus on, but sort of much more broadly on the transactional data, like financial data, accounting data, supply chain data, and they tend to focus on the industries that they tend to know. So it was really interesting to me to meet who eventually became my co-founders and see the world through their eyes and realize, oh, this is a specialized set of knowledge that I don't have. But what I can bring to the party is advanced software design and a background in producing large computing systems that can scale and have a good user interface and things like that. And what I was told by my co-founders was, hey, that's probably all we need to win in this space, because these industrial companies have suffered from, a relative lack of innovation, for 20 years and largely still do.
Hmm. Great point. And I want to dive into that a little bit. We always talk about when we're consulting, we always look for the workarounds. And when someone has an Excel spreadsheet on their local machine, that's a proprietary database that they do some sort of analysis on to derive value in the organization. And those connections back to whether it's Salesforce or some other database that doesn't have that UX. Really, companies were hiring people to do that analysis and presentation of data. I think there was a wave of folks that thought dashboards or visualizations like a Tableau, et cetera, were going to overcome that. But in this unique market you found, and I want to just touch on this because it's a real strategic insight, as you talked about, is that the prevailing view was, let's gather as much data as we can and employ economies of scale. And not that you don't have economies of scale, but you added value to that. You added scope, if you will, like you said, bringing in the user experience, bringing in the ability to manipulate that data and focusing on the output, the analytics, rather than the input of the data. In hindsight, Mark, that's just like advanced common sense. But when you and your co-founder started putting this together, maybe did some initial customer discovery interviews or even maybe talked to some investors, what was the initial feedback?
Well, I'd love to say that we knew exactly what we're going to build, from the outset. We didn't.
Totally.
But we used the tools that you and I learned about at Berkeley. You and I went to Berkeley and got our MBAs there. We At the beginning we used those tools, including the Lean Canvas,
Yep.
and I still have on my bookshelf the Startup Owner's Manual by Steve Blank, and we tried to follow those rules, or I shouldn't say rules, but guides, and they were helpful. But once we started building product, it became much more of a, I would say, intuition game, and was, especially in the early days, guided by one of my co-founders, Brian, who had this long background in this space and just was building the tool he always wished that he had, because he'd always been on the sort of side fence of depending on data and
Sure.
trying to do analytics on top of it. So that intuition, took us through the first, let's say, 2 years, and we didn't have customers for quite a while. We had, we'll maybe talk about investment and how we were able to secure the investment. We were given a lot of runway to develop the product, and I think in hindsight, we could have taken wrong turns, and that would have been the end of it.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't be where, to the degree we've had success, we wouldn't be there today.
Well, so you touch on two things, if I could. Like you talked about, you said no revenues, but then you talked about a lot of runway.
Runway in terms of cash in the bank.
Got it. And so where did this come from? Was this was from some pre-seed investors, friends and family? Had you raised a formal seed round? Like what gave you that initial war chest to begin to really pursue this past a nice to have to actually something that is buildable and scalable?
Yeah. So the initial round of investment came from a VC in Seattle named Second Avenue Partners that had invested at a startup that I was at previously with the CEO who became the CEO of my current company, Seeq. So actually, we can go back because you kind of touched on, I think earlier we talked about, well, why startups maybe
Yeah.
in general. In my undergrad, I did my undergrad at the University of Waterloo in Canada, which if you go to engineering there, you are in the co-op program. There's no choice. And so you do 4 months of school, 4 months of work, 4 months of school, all the way through.
Wow.
And so I had 6 different co-op terms with 4 different companies. My first term was very, I think, formative because it was with a startup. And then I had a couple of terms with Microsoft, big company, obviously. And then I went to Microsoft after school. I had that experience at a big company, and I realized I really like small companies. And so, yeah, I took the chance to join what was a drone startup. Back then, we called them unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. This was in 2005. And it was a great startup. It was led by a great CEO. His name was Steve Sliwa. And we had a good outcome. The company ended up getting sold to Boeing. I wasn't an early enough employee for it to really be a life-changing event for me, but I kind of got a taste of like, okay, this is what success looks like in a startup.
Wow.
And so when you and I were in school, part of my goal for me going to school was, can I set myself up to be on the ground floor of a startup? And I don't know what it's going to be and what it looks like. And of course, I was talking to everybody in class about, what they were looking for in their MBA, and kind of like glomming on to folks that were thinking about a startup. But I wouldn't say that anything really piqued my interest in terms of what various classmates were doing.
Mm-hmm.
In hindsight, some of our classmates have been really successful.
They have.
And
Which
they
is the
had great
beauty of
ideas.
business school, right? It's it's learned, it's that humility of celebrating the success of others, and that's what I know we're doing here. But was it, so again, we talked about that sand in your shoe, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a previous guest, Cal Lay, he said, I'm fundamentally unemployable. When he sees a problem, he just has to address it, right? And another organization may not have the same prioritization that he does. And so you were actively seeking your tribe, and you talked a little bit about it, but that's one of the key components from my research, and I'd be interested from your experience in terms of, is the initial product a thing, or is it the team?
Definitely the team, in my
There it
opinion.
is. You heard it here, folks.
Yeah, definitely the team. And we went through the phases of forming, norming, storming, and performing eventually. But the key thing was having all the right ingredients. So, starting with the investment, the CEO of my former startup was going to be the CEO of this startup, and he put me in touch with Brian, who I mentioned earlier, who had sort of the vision for the product. And so I got convinced by them that this was a great opportunity. Steve secured the funding, basically said, "Hey, I'm starting a new company," and got funding. That's really all he had to say, right? After being
well, that's an interesting point, and I don't want to get us off track, but sometimes, as a founder, it's the second act that's the hardest, right? Because you have all these expectations. And so whether you want to address that now or put a pin in it, I want to understand a little bit more about, like, how did you observe a first act versus second act, et cetera?
Yeah, I think I can talk to Steve's first act to a certain degree. So
Sure.
he was not the founder of the first company. He came in as a CEO and was the one to take it to an exit.
Got it.
And the second act, I think for him, being truly at the ground floor and forming the company, it was a different experience for him. He was really great at managing the investment side of things. He basically served all the non-development functions at the company, he and one other person. So in terms of finance and working with the initial set of investors and then later securing more rounds of funding, all of those things came naturally to him. And I knew based on my observation of him that they would come naturally to him. And so it was an easy sort of place to hitch my wagon to.
Totally. Totally.
And so that's one piece, right, of the sort of ingredients that were key in my view. As I said before, I was bringing the development experience, and I also knew that I could probably recruit some really great engineers from previous startups to previous jobs. And so I could bring that. And I'm a very passionate engineer. I love to code. It's like, that's no problem. So you mentioned, like, do I see a problem and I want to solve it? And I love coding because you can just sit down and solve it usually if you try hard enough. So I love coding. And then Brian, as I said, was bringing really the vision and the understanding, the really, really deep understanding of the problem. And then there was one other founder that was kind of bringing in the current industry relationships.
Okay.
So we knew that we needed to have a relationship with the vendors that were storing the data.
Got
And
it.
so he brought that sort of Rolodex and credibility.
So when you say like, just as an example, like an AWS or an Azure or something like that.
Now, in his case, he was coming from what I mentioned earlier, OSIsoft. They're the premier vendor, and they've since been purchased by Aviva, premier vendor of the databases that store this type of data.
Got it.
And so to me, the key thing and why I so quickly answered team is that that's the reason we were successful. It's not that we could, produce software that just hit the nail on the head immediately and was a runaway success. We were confident, and I had enough trust in everybody that was on the founding team, because we quickly kind of expanded to about 10 people, once we hired all the engineers. So I kind of consider them to be the founding team. Once we expanded to those people, I had confidence that we could weather a lot of storms, and we'd be probably afforded a fair amount of VC capital to weather a couple of storms as a result of the success of the previous startup and the CEO's track record.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. Mark, you've talked about some really key aspects, and that is that when you looked at the market, you saw an economies of scale market and brought some scope, right? You added that user experience, the analytics piece, rather than focusing on maximizing the input at scale, you focused on the quality of the output. That was a key. And then even though you had that insight, how do you operationalize that, if you will? And you've told us that the team is key. And I can't agree with you enough there that your first piece out of the gate is you may have a good idea, but it's the quality of that team. And then as you went a little bit deeper into your team, it's a lot of it is credibility and experience. There's something to be said for having the stripes, if you will, whether they're earned or experience. That's a key element to that. So you've kind of have this nucleus, right? You're at this point, and now you're iterating on the product. How did you know when you and the team found product market fit, where you really felt like your customers were coming to you? Or did it take a few rounds of funding and a few iterations to get to that point?
It did take multiple rounds of funding, which is not ideal, but in our case, ultimately, it's what allowed us to, the time to get to a product that was going to resonate with customers. What I would say is the moment that I feel like we knew we were onto something, we had our very first customer was a pharmaceutical, or is a still a customer, Bristol Myers Squibb. And they would tell us there's just nothing else on the market that does this even close to it. And we need this. So we're going to buy it. And then when we deployed it and it actually could stand up to their use, and, obviously you still iterate pretty quickly, and there's some desperate nights of debugging and troubleshooting. But when you have something that your customers are willing to overlook the flaws on, that's when I think you hit that sort of product market fit. It's one thing to say that I'll go and buy it, or that I think it's valuable, but when it becomes ingrained in the work such that they can't really or don't want to live without it, you've got something. And I felt that way with Bristol Myers Squibb.
And so in that respect, this is something that I often talk about in class, and that is you can develop great technology, but you can't push that technology onto a customer and have that be a long-term sustainable business model when compared to understanding a user's need and creating that pull. You clearly didn't, just push this product on Bristol Myers Squibb. They came to you, you pulled them in. And so if you were to really look at that customer's pain point, what was the pain point that your product solved?
I would say the pain point is I cannot quickly look at my time series data and do the mathematical operations and visualize it in a way that allows me to pursue problem solving within my plant. It takes me too long. I have to go into Excel. I have to relearn how to do some, column manipulation in Excel that's too hard. And that's the key. That was the key difference. And one thing I'll say about initial adoption is that it's easy to get false positives.
Yeah, tell us about that.
You have a champion, let's call a person a champion, that looks at your product and says, this is great. We need this. They see a demo. You're at a trade show. They bring you in, and they are trying to push it on other people. And they're telling you that your product's great. I'm pushing it. It's gonna go great. And then the people that it's being pushed on are like, what is this? I don't need this.
You said something really key there, Mark, that caught my attention. Even though you have a champion that may have been attracted to you, that's an important element of a B2B sale is how is that person advocating for you when you're not in the room?
It's so key. Exactly right. That's the definition of a champion. They are advocating for you when you're not in the room. And you can have, especially, when you think of the crossing of the chasm curve, when you're in the you're in the very first phases, you can have folks that are just really passionate about technology and they just see something that looks cool and shiny and they're not the right champion for you. And it's hard to recognize those early on. And you can survive them. Obviously we did. But, we had our very first customer fell into that category, plunked down, a credit card to buy our software.
Wow.
And we were like, oh, great, but, it didn't go anywhere. And so the degree to which they advocate is one thing. Are they advocating for you to solve the right problem? Because sometimes your software can get a bad reputation or a black market against it within an organization because you have a champion that maybe doesn't totally understand the problem that is being solved or thinks your software can solve a lot of problems it can't. And that can be very detrimental to your overall effort to sell within that enterprise. And we don't, by the way, Jeff, we don't have, thousands of customers. Our customer count is on the order of like 300.
Wow.
Very large customers.
Right.
But, not a ton. So it's important that your reputation is really solid, that you have really high NPS scores, and that you have, multiple advocates within an enterprise.
You said a lot there, and that NPS score can't be overlooked. And not just an organization-wide NPS, although that's valuable, but what's the dispersion of that? When you have these high-value customers, that NPS score is very important, but you have to look at the variance of that. And do you have some huge champions balancing out some huge detractors? Or is the mean, are they pretty well clustered around that mean, knowing that you're meeting the goals and objectives of everyone in that value stream? That's really hard to get that insight into an organization. Not many folks want to let you in to give you that perspective.
Yeah, we've been big on metrics, and we've transitioned. One other thing to note is that, and this was a big event in our history, we've transitioned from being a largely on-premise, software company, still charging a yearly subscription, but deploying on-premise, to being a SaaS, cloud deployed piece of software. Even when we were on premise, we were trying to collect that type of data, and we've only been, increasing it. So, we have a Slack channel where all of our NPS scores come in, about 20 or so a day, and we get to see, the number, and we get to see if they left any feedback. But it's really important that those scores, I would say you want 98% of them to come in at 8 or above. And we're lucky that we do have those high scores. I believe that especially for, I would say most software products that get built these days, they're solving a problem that technically you can solve some other way. So it's just more work, or, you're just much more inefficient at it. And so you're always, in a sense, battling against an incumbent as a software vendor, some sort of incumbent. If you're lucky enough to have something that is just solving problems never been solved before, great. But in our case, the incumbent really was Excel. And when you're battling an incumbent, I forget where I heard this, but I totally believe it's true. You have to be 10 times better than the incumbent. And so you have to have those types of NPS scores, because the person is inherently comparing you against what their next best alternative is. When the NPS score says, how likely are you to recommend this? It's a natural thing to be saying, well, I'm recommending it above and beyond what you would have to do if you didn't have it. And so if you don't have those metrics, it can be really hard to know, both from a product direction, which of course I'm primarily concerned with, to know that your product direction is a good one, but also to know what kind of a sales cycle am I facing, as a seller selling the software. Am I heading into an organization that is pretty lukewarm on this software? that information is so critical, and I'm glad that we've been gathering it, with the consent of our customers.
And that is what's key, is that it's freely given data,
Right.
and obviously you can trust that. I love this idea of unseating an incumbent. I'm very pragmatic when I go into an organization to understand what I'm trying to unseat. If you go back to first principles, right, the law of inertia, it's a powerful force. And that concept of 10x is directionally absolutely correct. And when you're unseating something like Excel, I think what's interesting about a product like Excel is, even if it doesn't do what we need, or it takes longer to do what we need, folks always feel like they're in control of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see that to an outside vendor or a third-party software, it feels like some of that control is ceded, right? What's happening behind the scenes? You can't tweak the formulas as well. For example, you can't, the formatting, etc. Little things, but they mean a lot. So I'm going to ask you a pointed question, and you can choose to pass, but I'd be interested in your opinion. And that is, how does your organization handle apathy as the incumbent when you're looking at a new customer or gaining share of wallet in an existing customer?
Well, I think in the beginning, apathy or indifference was a major issue because we were kind of carving out a new category of software, time series data analytics for industrials. Some industrials companies would say, yeah, we've always been doing analytics. We understand the value. Many customers were not in that camp. And so we were trying to educate them on just the value of doing analytics rather than here's how we do analytics and why it's the best.
So in that, let me double click on that, Mark. It's the value of analytics. Was this an industry or industries where you have 30 years experience? I know when the machine is deviating or the production's below, or I've got a clipboard with some manual entries that a lab tech gathered, etc. Was that what you mean when you were going up against the need for analytics at all?
Yeah. The industries that we serve often use a phrase that's some variation of the Great Resignation. And what they're talking about is all of this tribal knowledge going out the door as these 30, 40-year tenured folks retire. And so that was the initial battle. Those folks weren't resigning. But now we're at the point where, especially in these sort of sometimes, referred to as kind of dirty industries, like the ones that are getting, in the manufacturing world, that it isn't necessarily the place that you think when you come out of school, I definitely want to work at that company or in that field.
Not wait.
Yeah, exactly. So, the younger generation wasn't necessarily targeting those companies, those industries. And so you had this threat of a big turnover. And I would say about 5 years into the company, in the life of our startup, there was this big realization that we had to figure out how to capture that knowledge. And that ended up being a big part of the software that we developed was around knowledge capture. Not only here's the analytics that I did, but here's why I did it and how I did it and why it's important. And so battling that at the beginning, but then it becoming almost like a tailwind for us was kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Well, that's amazing. And it proves that point of balancing quantitative and qualitative information. Right? So just Amazon is a company that's famous for incorporating the voice of the customer and balancing what the data says where we're at today versus where the expectation is of where we're going tomorrow. And even if the qualitative data doesn't hit the nail on the head, so to speak, it can be absolutely directional in terms of limiting the opportunity space or shrinking the battlefield. That's what I always go back to. What Bezos said was, people always ask him, where will Amazon be in 10 years? And he says, I have no idea, but I do know customers don't want to pay more. They don't want to wait longer for their packages, right? And they don't want less value from Prime. And that seems common sense, but especially when you're in a startup, and if you were to map a 2x2 of your industry, how do you know where to begin or where to play? And oftentimes it matters quite a bit where not to play.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that we had to make conscious decisions on was we connect to a lot of different data sources sort of in a relatively light fashion.
Okay.
And we could have, I think, we could have credibly tried to market ourselves as an alternative to a data lake. So you have all these data sources, just put Seeq on top, and then you don't have to worry about, doing a big expensive data lake. There were some customers that did that and sort of had that benefit. But we knew that if we tried to go down that value prop route, that we were going to hit a lot of competition that we weren't necessarily prepared to take on. Because if you really do want to be a data lake, there's all kinds of security sort of issues and data replication issues and all kinds of stuff that we knew that we wanted to concentrate on analytics. And so that's an important example from our history of just choosing what fight we're going to go pick. and it helped that there was really not anybody truly addressing the analytics space. We could see all kinds of competition forming for the, let's call it the data lake sort of space. And, big data, as we talked about earlier, was such a buzzword. So we knew that there would just be a crowded space there.
Well, that sounds like a classic red ocean, blue ocean case study to talk about. Let's move the story along a little bit. And so you have this customer, Bristol Myers Squibb, where you have that product market fit. Was it up and to the right from that point? And did other customers come to you because of that same value proposition? Were you maybe pushed by certain customers to alter your value proposition to meet their needs? And how did you make the decision versus staying standardizing and customizing to see that growth and to get to the point where you're at today?
Those are great questions. So it wasn't up and to the right.
That's good.
All
right, man. All right. Real talk. I love it.
Even after, we had our first couple of customers, it was still a very, very long sales cycle, well more than a year to get a customer on board. The next major milestone for us was that a large oil and gas company kind of centered a significant redesign of their overall approach to both upstream and downstream. So in oil and gas, upstream is production of oil, kind of pulling it out of the ground, and then downstream is refining.
And if you want to know more about the oil business, you can go back and check out my conversation with RJ Burr, where we got real deep into the oil business. So there's a lot of background on that. But so, Mark, you're talking about upstream versus downstream and a highly commoditized business.
Exactly.
Tell me more.
That's right. They believed, I think rightfully so, that they had been collecting data and not using it enough, and that a lot of profitability and optimization opportunities were to be had if they could bring in good tools. And they started with, basically like a $2,000 purchase in a little tiny part of this company. And then word sort of spread and spread to the right people, and the right people were in charge of this big rethink. And that ended up being a really big deal for us, both in terms of just revenue, but then in terms of deployment, it was and still is our largest deployment with the most number of users. And we had to go pedal to the metal to develop the product to meet those needs. And you asked about custom development versus, off the shelf.
Yeah, exactly.
Features. We were fortunate in that they kept telling us, we want everything that you do to be off the shelf. Now, there were some exceptions, but they had that foresight, and they've dealt with enough vendors, and they've dealt with enough custom software and been burned that they said, we believe in the direction you're going. We love that you're taking input from us. We don't want what you do to be custom for us. And like I said, I think, there ended up being a couple of custom pieces, but for the most part, we just kept developing our product in the direction we were headed, in broad strokes, and it was meeting their needs. The biggest issue was the scale. And, harkening back to the on-premise versus cloud issue, the on-premise nature, I would sometimes kind of phrase it to them as, hey, imagine if you had to manage your refineries by looking through a little like peephole from the outside, and you had to tell people through the door what to change because it wasn't like going fast enough.
It's a beautiful analogy.
That's the way it was for us trying to help them scale out and tackle a whole bunch of performance problems that in the end were our problems to solve in software, partly due to the hardware that they were able to deploy, but ultimately, we had to address them. And the primary users were in Kuala Lumpur. And so this scaling effort was incredibly stressful. I talk about this at our company meetings about how I would wake up at 4 a.m. and just have this feeling of dread of looking at my phone to see all the problems that had happened in Kuala Lumpur overnight. And it was all hands on deck, trying to fix those problems.
Sure.
Very stressful time that we ended up getting through, but it was the thing that ultimately hardened our software such that we started being very confident in being able to sell to anybody and know that we were going to be able to handle their load. The feature set was going to be wide enough that it would meet their use cases. That was the key sort of next milestone for us.
And they say trial by fire, but it may be cliche, but it is often the case. It's that the software will break, the product will break. Fact. It goes back to your earlier comment in the value of your team being that first product that allows you to be ready to weather those, let's be honest, storms, plural, as you go down this path to scaling. So you've got Bristol Myers Squibb, you've got this oil major under your belt. At this point, are VCs knocking on your door? Are you still having to, give your value proposition or sell your value proposition to continue that expansion? That's my first question. Second question is, did you have a fear of saturating the market and having to look afield for growth? Or was there enough depth in your existing field that follow-on investments would just allow you to double down, if you will?
Yeah. So my experience with VCs, I think it was really interesting to have a front row seat to the VC world in a way that I didn't have at any of my previous startup engagements. Obviously, as a founder, I was close. I wasn't necessarily managing those relationships and sort of cultivating the VCs. Our CEO was doing that. But I got to see how it works. And what I think is really interesting about VCs is that they can go through a lot of cycles with you where they're super interested and they're telling you that you're the best thing since sliced bread and really trying to flatter you. And then you get to a point where it's like, okay, we want to take your money. And then it just and then it switches like, oh, okay.
Well, I need to see the metrics. I need to see the financials, etc.
Now the only thing that matters is the spreadsheet.
Right.
So I think that our success with the oil and gas major was set the stage really for our Series B investment. And I would say that Series B investment was good, not great in terms of dilution and things like that.
Sure.
It was really the time between B and C where we started to get a critical mass of customers. And maybe this kind of speaks to your second point. Like there is still a lot of depth for us in the industries that we serve, but we are expanding. There are sort of adjacent industries that we hadn't really tackled and we're starting to tackle. So for example, semiconductors, we had our first major semiconductor and has become one of our biggest customers.
Which is historically a very isolated or industry in the sense that they don't really let outsiders in. and whatever you provide for them, you provide in a silo, and that information does not come out. And
Yep.
so I just want to emphasize for our listeners that just because an industry may be adjacent doesn't mean that that cost to expand into that industry is equal or less, right? You don't always get economies of scale as you expand in industries because of requirements, barriers, etc. Now, once you're in, that helps keep you in, but there is that investment in the beginning. And so I'm going to hazard a guess that that was one of the reasons why semiconductors, even if they were a fantastic use case, weren't necessarily your first expansion.
That's right. Exactly right. And I think in our case, a key um, event was that we ended up having a sales engineer that came from semiconductors and really had deep knowledge. And we weren't necessarily saying that we were ready or really thinking about semiconductor. And he was like, no, you don't understand. Like, this will work. If we present this in the right way, it's going to meet a huge need. And so that was a key catalyst. And I think another really interesting thing is that the features and the approach to analytics for semiconductors ended up being a similar sort of the initial engagement was with the facilities folks. So in semiconductors, you have these fabs, and they are incredibly well managed in terms of environment, HVAC systems, everything else. So put aside the actual lithography or pinning of the chips, just the surrounding area is heavily instrumented and controlled. And the same goes for electric car manufacturers. And we have an electric car manufacturer. They construct batteries, and they have these clean rooms and similar sort of atmospheric issues and environment issues.
Sure.
And so we had all of that experience as a result of, I'll call it an early adopter in the EV world. And the person with the semiconductor experience could put the two together and say, no, it's the same problem over here. So it was fortunate. We've had a lot of lucky sort of fortunate people come to us in terms of like employees and also customers. Customers, I will say, when it comes to manufacturing, a lot of customers are not super private about optimization techniques and things like that. So we have a user conference every year, and we have lots of customers speaking at the user conference to each other in the same industry, saying, here's how we're using analytics to improve our operations, especially in like pharmaceuticals, where the majority of the profit comes from the patent, not so much from the manufacturing, right? You hold the patent, and that's how you make money. And so, if they help each other manufacture their drugs faster and make more money on their patents, it's often not really a truly competitive situation. And same is kind of true for a lot of the industries that we serve.
Interesting. I took a note here, and it's an interest of mine and a hypothesis, if you will, interested in your opinion. But in an organization, as you grow, looking for new markets, etc., how much of innovation, and whether that's product innovation or just market expansion, etc., how much of that is dictated top down? Leadership does the strategic planning. How much of that is bottom up, as you talked about, sort of organic from your employees based on past experience, etc.? Or do you find a balance between those two as a way to really hit that innovation sweet spot?
I think it's been a balance, but I would say for us, a lot of the vision has come from, our set of leaders, which has been expanding. For example, we hired a VP of engineering. That was my initial role, VP of engineering, and now I'm chief product officer. And we hired a VP of engineering who's just awesome and has really led the charge in terms of innovation on AI. And so as it has expanded in terms of our leadership team, I'd say that we've had a lot of innovative ideas coming from different parts for the big, like gnarly things that we go tackle. And then a lot of, let's say, more day-to-day innovation we try to let it flourish at all levels. So, for example, and Google and other companies do this. We set aside a certain amount of time for developers to just do whatever they want. It
Oh,
doesn't,
wow. That's really cool.
right? So that gives them this feeling of autonomy and purpose to
Sure.
try to influence the product in a way that they want, and maybe explore some idea that they have. And that's always been a fruitful thing. It tends, sometimes big things come out of that, but mostly it's kind of more the little things that really can, for some set of customers, make them just overjoyed.
That's really, I didn't realize that was something that you all had done. And I'm a big advocate. Clark and I always say the best way to have a good idea is to take a walk, take a nap, take a shower, right? Let our minds relax and take away the noise and actually let the subconscious engage for a bit. And those aha moments come from that.
And I think you have to be in an environment at work where when you have those moments, you feel like there's an outlet. Because you have to, I'm a big believer in Dan Pink's research on autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
If you add those three things, you have all this intrinsic motivation within your company, and you have people who get out of the shower with their idea and actually go have the motivation to go off and do something.
Yeah, very cool. I love that. Well, as we kind of move here into the last phase of our conversation, Mark, tell me a bit about what's on the table for Seeq. You talked about bringing in a VP of engineering to add AI to, or if further incorporate AI into that analysis piece. So from a strategy standpoint and also a technology standpoint, are you still relying on the other players to bring the data to the table and you're focused on the analysis piece and your resources are there? Have you begun to kind of go wider, if you will, and capture more of that value chain? And then how is that growth coming in the areas that you are focused? Is it solely technology driven or are there other levers?
So I think we're still sticking to our guns in terms of wanting to leverage data where it exists rather than trying to be any sort of system of record. But I'd say that the rules are starting to bend a little bit because there's not necessarily a place that is natural to capture the knowledge that is heading out the door with the Great Resignation that we talked about earlier. So we have facilities in our software where it's really just natural to jot down a bunch of information about the process that's taking place in your plant. So in that respect, we are kind of becoming a system of record. But we've always had also the strong conviction to make everything that we do in our UI possible to do in APIs.
Oh, wow.
So that's an important thing to be able to say to a customer, especially if you're storing some of their data that they suddenly decide they want to kick you out the door. They want to get access to that. So having access to absolutely everything kind of allows us to bend the rules and not sort of contravene our primary statement on whether we store data.
Yeah. So we talked about the areas of growth, but then also going forward, where is analytics going? I mean, if we talked about the leap from algorithmic-led analytics that were probably part of big data and definitely the dashboards that definitely a generation of leaders are used to, and to now more of these neural network-led sorts of analysis. What is Seeq doing, and how does Seeq maintain its differentiation as the technology is evolving faster?
So with respect to AI and large language models, what I'm happy about is that they are almost commoditized at this point, in that
I would agree.
You can essentially make use of a bunch of different LLMs, but the part that's not commoditized is what is the retrieval augmented generation aspect of it? What are you feeding in as context? How can you build the context and the associated prompts that result in really rich information and increasingly visualizations and generated user interfaces? All of that is right up our alley because we supply a lot of augmented information that an LLM cannot just retrieve from the raw data. If you were to take, first of all, an LLM cannot act upon like 5 years of time series data. First, it doesn't really do math that well, although,
No, it's a
you know,
statistics engine,
right.
but not in the way that we think as mathematics. It's a statistics engine around vectors, which have really, right, it's just language. It's not numbers.
Yeah, well, I mean, the vectors, it boils things down into the tokens, and that's what makes up the vectors. But those tokens are language. You're right, they're language, oriented tokens, as opposed to sort of hard math that's done by, the traditional hard math that's done by a CPU. So we play a huge role in supplying that math, we call it our calculation engine, on top of the time series data and turning it into something that is more of a natural language form. So, for example, our
Please.
customers often use time series data to identify when an anomaly is happening, or perhaps when their math would predict that a piece of equipment needs maintenance. And we call those conditions. The conditions have names in English, and they often have properties in English. And the set of them is relatively small as compared to the raw data that was used to produce them. So you can take those and they will fit into the context windows of the LLMs, and you can use all of the insights that are only available if you've got this analytics layer already. You can use those to feed into the LLM and get all kinds of great information. So our vision for the future is there will be primarily a chat-based interface for what you do at work, especially as a higher level person, an executive or plant manager, things like that. And you'll have this one prompt, and I happen to believe it's going to be Microsoft Copilot. You have this one prompt, and there'll be all kinds of companies that plug into that prompt to provide essentially expertise to answer questions. Because the AI ecosystem technologies are so fascinating. The way that you can chain together, various agents and have them digest parts of your prompt or all of your prompt and sort of raise their hand and say, I can answer, I can provide this thing, which you can then contextualize into your broader answer.
Really great background there, Mark. The thing that you touched on that was really interesting to me was this concept of agents. And, one of my kind of theses that I always share with my students is that in your career, although in university, you're being taught how to manage people, your role is going to involve managing AI agents. And I don't think we're at all preparing our students who probably have a 40-year career ahead of them. We're not preparing them. With that being said, is that something where Microsoft's going to take that value through Copilot and do that management, become a management layer, if you will? Is it a provider like Seeq that becomes that management layer of those agents? Because Microsoft will have the agents, right, through OpenAI. I mean, they will control the technology behind the agents. It's the management of those agents. Or is that going to be a layer of responsibility at the organization level, in your opinion?
I do think that Microsoft will own that part of the layer. They will own the orchestration of agents. And, there will, AWS will obviously have a thing or two to say about it.
Sure, yeah.
But especially in our industries, Microsoft is the predominant player. And so when these companies think about their AI strategy, they tend to look at Microsoft Copilot as probably the future for them. And so Copilot has a vision, and it's still very early days for Copilot, but they have a vision of allowing vendors to plug in, the same type of vision they had for Windows, make an operating system that anybody can build apps on top of. Copilot is really no different. The apps in this case are AI agents that can, respond to prompts. And Seeq will be one of those agents. And we hope that we will be one of the predominant agents in use in manufacturing settings in the industrial verticals that we serve, because we believe that we can provide the most cogent data and the most relevant data for making higher level decisions. Like, tell me about all of the downtime that happened in plants A, B, and C last week, and
Right.
break it down by shifts. Like, that's going to be very difficult to get from traditional SQL databases,
Mhm.
or it's not going to come from a knowledge base or something like that. So that's where we think we can play a role.
So you have Microsoft using their playbook of being the OS, if you will, and just translating that to a new industry. Maybe they need some of OpenAI's intelligence to make that OS fully capable. And then, whereas just as Microsoft had Excel, PowerPoint, etc., on top of their operating system, they'll have these agents on top of the operating system, but those agents will go further than, right? Whereas before, humans would engage with Word to type the document. In this case, now Copilot's going to gather that data, analyze it, put it forward to the managers, and then at that level, the managers will actually possibly still be algorithms that can then deliver that final output, right? Whereas today, that requires a human has to take that data, manipulate it, and implement it. Microsoft's arguing we can do the manipulation and the implementation on many vectors. And so humans, whereas maybe you needed 100 to run a plant, making up a number, you may need 50 because 50 of those jobs are actually doing things that either a robot or an algorithm can control.
Yeah, that's right. And we think of AI in several stages of development, at least for our roadmap. The first stage is just helping you use an application. So that's basically just drawing on knowledge bases and drawing on the specifics of an application to tell you how to use it. And we have, in our calculation, we have a domain-specific language that is proprietary, so people have to learn it. That's a bit of a barrier, but now with AI, it's super easy to learn. The AI can tell you almost exactly what you want to do, but if you just describe in English what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So that's first stage, AI assistance. So then the next stage is, okay, you told me how to do it. Actually, I don't want to do it. I just want you to do it. So go ahead and manipulate the application on my behalf. Okay, great. We call that action agent. But then there's what I think is the real sort of game changer, which is I need to do this type of analysis, and I don't want to do it myself. I'm going to give you a high level sort of goal for what I want to see, and you go off and do whatever you want, and just come back to me in the prompt. Don't even show me some UI. I don't want to have to learn a UI. Just give me exactly what I need, and just comes back to you in the prompt. And that next stage of really AI first thinking and design, that's where we've got some lighthouse customers sort of doing that right now with our software. And then the final stage is that ecosystem. So they're not at our prompt, they're at the Microsoft Copilot prompt. And our information is just one aspect of the answer that they're getting back, potentially.
Sure.
Other vendors are supplying other parts.
It's incredible how hyper competitive this is getting. Just a conversation that I had this morning is, I think many people who are in leadership roles today probably grew up in either the Web 1.0 boom or even the mobile application boom, Web 2.0, right, back in the late aughts, early teens, what have you. But those took it, and I don't have the data, right? But those were measured in years, those changes. And now the releases are coming so quickly. I mean, at least on a quarterly basis, that anyone who's created an opinion of AI 6 months ago, that's probably an outdated opinion of its capabilities and its abilities. So with that being said, I can't emphasize enough to our listeners, and Mark's really spoke to this, is the idea of have an AI vision, a roadmap of where it's going. And even if you don't know where it's going, look for the signposts that vendors, providers, and even your competitors are putting up. And in this case, Microsoft is, people joke that it was a Clippy, Copilot's the new Clippy. But in reality, maybe what if Clippy was just ahead of its time and Copilot is the reality today? How much will that disrupt business as you know it? And it seems like, Mark, you and the team are right on the forefront of that.
Yeah, I'd like to believe that. I will say it can feel scary. You know, I like to, talk about things in terms of the singularity that's coming and the technology curve accelerating,
Right.
and it's a scary thing as a startup, founder and vendor, a software vendor. But I think that as long as you are careful about where your differentiation is
Mm-hmm.
and you are trying to play on your strengths, then AI is an adder and not so much a, competition or, a sort of extinction level event. I'll say I wouldn't want to be in the sort of pure AI business, like trying to provide AI tools or things like that, because it's moving so fast. I'm glad I'm not there.
Totally. It's a commodity. And I was at a conference last fall, and it was laid out that you have the input layer, you have the LLMs that run on the hardware, and then you have the output. And the LLMs are a commodity, as you talked about earlier, are being commoditized. The chip layer or the processing layer is completely out of touch of any other individual company. And so as a result, you're left with the input and the output layers. And to going back to your original value proposition or your original thesis, right? The input is economies of scale. Yes, there's value in cleaning up data and organizing it and making it accessible. Absolutely, there's money to be had there. But that has to be done at such an incredible scale. And as a startup, I think you're smart to say, let's position ourselves on the output and ride the output revolution. Because you talked about a very key point, and it goes back to something we talked about earlier, is that Excel is a known UI, and adding a feature to an existing UI is a lot different than having someone start from scratch and relearn something, even if it's more intuitive, etc. I know from using LLMs, I'm very comfortable with talking to it, and we're literally programming it in English, which is its own revolution we don't have to talk about now, and the ability to prototype code using AI and to develop products that you can ship for and iterate very quickly. All of that activity on the output end of the spectrum, I think, is where the opportunity lies for startups and growing companies, right, that aren't Amazon or Google and have, right, double-digit percentages of the world's data under their control. So it's exciting. So just kind of in a snapshot, Mark, what lies ahead for you and the company?
Well, we're 12 years old, and so our latest investors' thesis would have us, pursuing an exit within 4 to 7 years. If it's earlier, great. The exit market has not been, too great for the last few years. So there's not
Right.
an IPO, not really an IPO market happening, and lots of things happening in the world. I don't think anybody can really predict if the window's going to open up again in a significant way. But that's kind of the time frame that we're on. And a major milestone for us is, after now 11 years, we're finally profitable, which is, maybe another shocking thing to know
Yeah, no
about.
small feat.
To know that, you go 11 years and you're running on VC money for that whole time. Now we are profitable, however small it may be, and that's a big kind of different feeling, mindset that you're under. You're like, oh, actually now I'm reinvesting funds that I've earned, and I'm not
Mm,
just burning. And
yeah.
that's we all as a management team really kind of took a step back, and we're like, oh, this is very different. So I think, in the years ahead, being profitable, having a strong set of customers, I think we're, positioning ourselves for a good outcome, and just trying to wait for the market to be timed right. And now, since we're not burning cash, we have that luxury.
Yeah. Well, just an amazing story, Mark, from being an MBA student with a bit of grain of sand in your shoe, looking for the right team, to now a company talking about reinvesting your own funds and tapping that kind of ultimate market of going public. It's an amazing journey. And not putting light on the fact that, as you said, it's been 12 years, but an amazing journey and just fantastic. So tell us a little bit about Seeq. Where can folks find out more about the company? You talked about your customer day, and then finally just a little bit about you, and where can folks catch up with you?
Sure. So our company is Seeq, SEEQ, and it's seeq.com. I'm still amazed that we got a 4-letter company
Domain,
back
right?
when we started. And we sell software to industrials, so tend to have that clientele. If you happen to be in those industries, then you might look us up.
Yeah.
And one thing I didn't mention is that we started the company entirely remote, and so we have always just worked out of our homes. And we actually even developed some software just completely separately from our primary, analytics software. We developed a remote floor plan app that makes us look like we're all in an office together, and allows us to really quickly get into conversations over Zoom and into meetings and things like that. And so we're spread all around. I'm spending my summers in Portland, and right now I'm spending my winter down in the Palm Springs area. We have lots of folks that are doing that kind of thing. But I'm happy for you to look me up on LinkedIn. I'm the only
we'll link to that in the show notes. But it's unique that your company is one who has embraced a distributed workforce and found a way to not only have results but keep the culture and continue to grow, and in fact have it be so successful that it's something you export to other companies. So when you stay user-centered, it's amazing what you find out.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And we look forward to that day in the hopefully not too distant future where you're at the New York Stock Exchange ringing the bell.
Oh, that would be great. Yep. I look forward to it too.
Thanks so much, Mark.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.